Alright, so earlier I finally talked about what is for me one of the most interesting and Marxists of the last 50 years. That, of course, being the continuation of my lectures on Louis Althusser. As a quick recap, Althusser studied at the École Normale Supérieure, I think, in Paris, and taught philosophy in Paris from 1948 until his death. His works included For Marx and Reading Capital, both published in 1965, and Machiavelli and Us, after his death in 1999. He was a member of the French Communist Party and died in 1990. There's another lecture that focuses more on Althusser's life and, shall we say, dramatic last final years. That will be online if anyone is interested. To jump right in, my lecture today will be on the essay Althusser published entitled Ideology and the Ideological State Apparatus. Unfortunately, with time constraints, I'm not going to get included to ideology and focus more on ideology, or the ideological state apparatus. A few terms that I want to define quickly, but I also want to, let's see. There's a few terms that I want to define quickly, but also explain that some of the terms Althusser uses will be put into a new light and redefined later. This will hopefully not be too confusing, as my quick definitions here are more textbook definitions, while the ones Althusser defines will be either more in-depth or more Marxist than what you will find in a standard poli-sci textbook. First, we need to define the word ideology. Marx has a very specific use of the term, and Althusser gets to that in his theory on ideology and ideologies. However, before we get there, we should lay out the definition that is standard for a more scholarly, college, Americanized graduate. Let's see. So ideology, as defined, is a coherent or a comprehensive set of ideas that explains and evaluates social conditions. They help people to understand their place in society and create a plan for social or political action. This is a fairly simple explanation, and both Marx and Althusser will create a much richer meaning and use of ideology, but we must build up to that. With that, let us jump into the essay proper. The first point we must grasp is not complex, but just the opposite, in fact. Marx claims that this will be, Marx claims that it's simple, but it will be the jumping point of Althusser at this point. That even a child must realize that in order to produce, a capitalist must produce two things. First, he must produce whatever he is producing, and second, he must reproduce the means of his production. This means simply that this may seem completely obvious, because the factory that does not reproduce its machines will cease to be a factory. However, what Althusser wants to point out is it's not just material means of production that must be reproduced, but he must also reproduce the existing relations of production. What does this mean? First, a simple reproduction is obvious. It is essential to foresee what is needed to replace what has been used up or worn out in production: raw materials, fixed installation, instruments of production, etc. However, it is not as simple as this, and this is where the relations come in. Relations of production, etc. However, let's see. Althusser claims that Marx is a genius here for resolving this problem, because in fact the reproduction of these means does not happen on the level of real conditions. Instead, what happens on the level of the firm is an effect of a deeper series of relations. To flesh this out in an example, we'll say that a capitalist, Mr. X, who produces woolen yarn in his spinning mill, he has to reproduce the conditions of his reproduction. But he does not produce them for his own production. Other capitalists do. A sheep farmer, a heavy engineer producing machine tools, etc., etc., onward to infinity. There's a Marxian analysis of this problem, but for the direction Althusser tends to take this lecture, it will be enough to bring up the problem and not to really discuss a more detailed resolution to it. Where we need to go now is something that some may have already picked up on. We have discussed the way in which capitalists are able to reproduce the material conditions of their production. What we need to discuss is how the ruling class reproduces the productive forces in society, in this case the reproductive labor forces, or how they reproduce labor power. Of course, we have been able to view material processes of reproducing these labor for quite some time. Wages allow workers to eat and sleep and dress himself in a way that allows him to present himself to work the next day. But Althusser points out that what we have now entered a domain in which we are able to see that this is not the case, and insists, in fact, that the reproduction of labor power happens predominantly outside of the firm rather than inside. The key to note here is the word predominantly, of course. Of course, the wages allow the worker to present himself to the factory the next day, as well as raise and educate children, etc., which, of course, reproduces labor power later. However, and Marx points this out, these wages are not used as a biological level reproduction of labor power. Instead, they reproduce in different ways the labor power. The phrase from Marx that Althusser uses is that English proletarians need beer, while French proletarians need wine. This term, the term used for the concrete need of the workers, beer as compared to wine, is an historical minimum as opposed to a biological minimum. That may be assumed. This is, of course, one way in which labor power is reproduced as a concrete context rather than a simple reproduced means of production that a capitalist would assume. Next, we must realize that labor must not simply recreate more labor, it must recreate competent labor. How is this achieved? Of course, in a historical context, competence was recreated at the job sites through apprenticeships, etc. However, it has moved far from that and is solidified into a system that creates competence outside of production through the capitalist school system. In these systems, divisions are made between job applicants, and there is created subsets of labor that are submitted to different types of reproduction of labor. One manual for laborers, one for technicians, one for management, etc. This creates a competence that is required by the reproduction of labor. However, this is not all that is learned at school. It should be rather obvious to anyone the fact one does not go to school, they hand you a manual, and as long as you're proficient at doing long division, you get a free pass. We learn rules in school, rules of good behavior, rules for interacting, etc. In other words, we learn the attitude one should observe in every agent in the division of labor, according to the job he is destined for. Rules of morality, civic, or professional conscience, which actually means rules for respecting the socio-technical division of labor and ultimately the rules of the order established by class domination. Althusser claims, or says also that we also learn to speak proper French or English in the States here, and to handle workers correctly, or actually how to order them about and be future capitalists. And this is the point Althusser raises when he says the reproduction of labor power requires not only a reproduction of its skill, but also at the same time a reproduction of its submission to the rulers of an established order, i.e. a reproduction and submission to the ruling ideology. To put it in a wider range, however, it is not just schools that do this, and by this I mean teach both ideology as well as competence in a workplace. Let's see. It is anything that Althusser classifies as an ideological state apparatus, which we'll get to in a minute, but which includes churches, religions, families, the army, etc. Which leads Althusser to make the statement that it is in the forms and under the forms of ideological subjection that provision is made for the reproduction of the skills of labor power, which takes us back to how Althusser can say that it's not from within the firm through real wages or ahistorical wages, but outside the firm that labor power is necessarily recreated through this learning the submission to an ideological rule. Now that we have a better understanding, thanks predominantly to Marx, again, much of this is clarified by Althusser, but originally resolved by Marx, we can almost return to the question of how does one reproduce the relations of production. However, we must first talk about society, more particularly what society is to a Marxist. Marx conceived the structure of every society is constituted by levels articulated by specific determination, which I'll flesh out in a minute. The infrastructure, or economic base, which is the unity of the productive forces and the relations of production on the one hand, and the other part is the superstructure, which in itself contains two levels, or instances. The first, the political legal level, which is law and the state, and the second is what Althusser calls the ideology, which includes different ideologies, which include religious, ethical, legal, and political ideologies. Not to be confused with just the straight state and law of legal ideologies being different from legal ideologies and political ideologies. We can see the society in a metaphorical sense very easily, in which any society is a building containing a base, which is the infrastructure, and on which the base are erected two floors of the superstructure. The use of this metaphor simplifies a few things. First, it allows us to see that the upper floors could not stay up alone if they did not rest precisely on the base. Thus, the object of the metaphor of the building is to represent the determination, in the last instance, of the economic base. In other words, the superstructure is determined by the economic base. We can also view the two floors as partially autonomous. On one hand, however, they are autonomous only insofar as they are both determined by the base. Next, there is a reciprocal action of the superstructure onto the base. The superstructure does not exist in a vacuum, but does not have any bearing, but does have a bearing on the way the base, in a way, on the base, but only so far again as determined by the base. Moving quickly along here, Althusser points out one problem with using the metaphor here, and that no matter how well it describes the facts that we can observe around us, and it most certainly seems to be pretty evident that the metaphor is apt. However, it is still simply a metaphor, and thus remains in the realm of the descriptive. He points this out not only because he insists that it is wrong, or simply that he wants to go beyond the metaphor, but he wants to go beyond the metaphor in a very specific way. Not in a way that shows the metaphor is outworn, but to take the metaphor from one level of the descriptive into the scientific. Before we can do that, however, one more detour must be taken quickly to explain Marx's theory of the state. In any case, the state is a repressive machine that is used to repress the interests of the subservient class, in our case, the proletariat, to the will of the ruling class. The state does this through two means. The first we'll talk about here, and the second will be brought up in a minute. The state must necessarily repress the interests of the working class, and in the first case, it does so through force. It uses force through repressive state apparatuses. Things like police force and the army are both repressive state apparatus. To put it succinctly, the state apparatus which defines the state as a force of repressive execution and intervention in the interests of the ruling class in the class struggle is quite certainly the state, and quite certainly defines its basic functions. Althusser has a problem, though, even though, again, there is no argument that this is a correct view of the state. In fact, the view of the state still remains a descriptive theory, in that it must be added to in order to bring it to the realm of the scientific. The first thing that we must view, the clarification between state power and the objective of this, and the objective of the political class struggle, and on the objective of the political class struggle. On the one hand, the first thing that we must view is the clarification between state power and the objective of the political class struggle, and on the other hand, the state apparatus. A state apparatus can survive even after a revolution, as seen by the bourgeois revolution in 19th century France, and even after a social revolution like that in 1917, in which a large part of the state apparatus survived after the seizures of state power. So let me quickly reiterate where we are in regards to the theory of the state before we can move on to Althusser's addition from bringing it from a descriptive theory into a scientific one. The state is a repressive state apparatus. State power and state apparatus must be distinguished, however. The objective of the state of class struggle concerns state power and using the state apparatus to oppress another class. The proletariat must seize state power in order to destroy an existing bourgeois state apparatus and replace it with a different one. What needs to be added in is not a clarification or a correction, but instead a new reality that is a distinction between the repressive state apparatus and something else. This reality is what Althusser names the ideological state apparatus. Let's quickly go over again what a state apparatus is, or what I've been calling a repressive state apparatus is, and what falls under this category. The repressive state apparatus uses violence in order to repress X to the ruling ideology. The things that fall under a repressive state apparatus are things like the police, the government, and the army. In its capacity to repress by violence, and which is not to be confused to be repressed by the army through ideology, from being like within it, a soldier or something that way. An ideological state apparatus is a certain number of realities which present themselves to the immediate observer to form a distinct and specialized institution. In other words, it's an institution that operates predominantly by ideology through a series of either linked or semi-linked interactions. So these include religious ideological state apparatuses, or ISAs, educational ISAs, family ISA, a legal ISA, which could be both simply being within the law or also being within like the legal system. Political ISAs, which are different from state repressive power because they contain things like political systems, political parties, things like this. The trade union ISA, the communications ISA, which is the media, and then the cultural ISA, which is literature, sports, art, everything like that. The distinction between an RSA, a repressive state apparatus, and an ISA, is how they function. The former predominantly, the RSA predominantly through violence, and the ISA predominantly through ideology. The police force will arrest you, of course, but they can also stand on a corner to maintain order. On the other hand, a teacher will teach you how to behave, but can also discipline you through expulsion. This means one important thing, that again, the word predominantly is important here. While the Army predominantly functions through violence, it also has a subset that can function through ideology, and vice versa. A teacher can operate through violence on a level below that which it operates through ideology. Between these, there is an attempt to finally bring the conversation full circle on how this relates to the relations of production. We must see that these ISAs, as these ISAs are the ones that are educating and reproducing the labor power, they are in fact not at stake in the class struggle, are in fact the site of the class struggle. Althusser points out a few realities about ideological state apparatuses and passages from his essay that I'm going to read quickly in order to hopefully illuminate the importance of these ISAs, which again are on a level that is not the base, but instead the superstructure of society. So he writes, all ideological state apparatuses, whatever they are, contribute to the same result, the reproduction and relations of production, i.e. of capitalist relations of exploitation. Each of them contributes toward this single result in a way proper to it. Political apparatus by subjecting individuals to the political state ideology, the indirect parliamentary or direct fascist, or democratic ideology, etc. The communications apparatus by cramming every citizen with its daily dose of nationalism, chauvinism, liberalism, moralism, etc. By means of the press, radio, television, etc. This concert is dominated by a single score, occasionally disturbed by contradiction. So in other words, the ruling ideology is what's at play in the actions of all these ideological state apparatuses, with few exceptions, occasionally disturbed by contradictions, those of the remnant former ruling class, or those of proletarians and their organizations and class struggle. Nevertheless, in this concert, one ideological state apparatus certainly has the dominant role. Although hardly anyone lends an ear to its music, it is so silent. This is the school. And so then, this is kind of the point he's trying to bring full circle again, is how it is in fact the school that really reproduces the means of production, but in two ways that you don't understand because of how entwined you are into this ideology of becoming subjected to the ruling ideology through things that seem unideological. To sum up, I think that Althusser is right on the money, but it's interesting. For those of you who remember my other lecture on Althusser about philosophy of Lenin, he has done his own project, but in reverse. He claims that there must be a philosophy of political action before there can be political action. In the same way that there must be a theory before there can be a scientific innovation. However, it seems that he outlines what essentially is the Maoist cultural revolution here, and this is where I think he has laid out exactly perfectly the drastic need for something along the lines of a cultural revolution, because, like he said, these ISAs are not at stake in the class struggle; they're in fact the site of the class struggle, and we need to make sure that they are in our focus during any kind of revolutionary activity, as well as any revolutionary activity aimed at the base. And with that, that'll be it. Thanks. Any guys?
So does he see the ideological apparatus as repressive as well, or how? Because I know you talked about those distinctions between and the similarities. So I was just wondering if, I guess I'm just kind of thinking more about how he thinks about the repressive aspects of that.
So when he says repressive, he's talking about a very specific thing, in that he's suppressing the will of one class to the will of the ruling ideology. And ideological state apparatuses do this predominantly through ideology rather than through violence like the police force. So they do it, as you mentioned, like in schools. Schools is one big thing that I didn't touch on, but it's really covered well. When he's talking about it, because of how much cultural influence our schools have, he goes so far as to say that the school now is the church of the past. To to a point where it's something that completely, totally can run our lives. And for the same reasons, because it's essentially gaining control of a subservient class to the order of the ruling ideology. Errol?
So was Louis Althusser a Marxist humanist?
No. No.
What was his ideology?
I mean, he's, I guess, like a scientific socialist, I think is what I would call him, in that he's very concerned with the actual scientific concrete struggle, as well as actually analyzing these both contemporary but like concrete actual ideas, and bringing Marxist theory into something that he talks about in one of his other essays, where he's talking about an idea of Marxist science or Marxist practice, which essentially is just a scientific revolution to the order of philosophy and politics. So he's not a humanist now; he's more concerned with the scientific.
I have a question, I guess, in relation to that, because I had heard that something about him being like an anti-humanist. Is that, I guess, similar, or like rethinking?
Yeah, that's pretty true. Yeah, I don't know a ton about it, but he was anti-humanist just because it's all scientific. But yeah, Chris.
So Althusser existed in the 20th century, and essentially he was the sort of counterweight to the Frankfurt School. And so the Frankfurt School were people like Marcuse, Adorno, Horkheimer. And basically their big spiel was, hey, we just found this early Marx stuff, all the stuff he never published, and stuff like the economic philosophical manuscripts of 1844, German ideology, the Grundrisse, and again, just all this stuff that was never published by Marx, Engels, Kautsky, Bernstein, or anybody. It got published in the Soviet Union afterwards. And so a lot of it's more focused on like early philosophical musings about alienation, because he's still reading Hegel. And this is what Marx was doing. Like the economic philosophical manuscripts were published when he was they were not published. He wrote them when he was 26, and they were a notebook. So basically, the Frankfurt School picks up these texts and like, wow, this is what Marx really wanted to say. All this stuff about alienation, this is so important. Althusser is basically against that. He has several essays against that. I mean, if you look on Marx.org, there's plenty. There's a specific essay about the economic philosophical manuscripts. But I mean, the basic thing that he distinguishes them is, one, alienation is not necessarily a concept you can measure, as opposed to, say, a literacy rate or an infant mortality rate. So that's the basic sort of cut of where he's going against, as far as like, as I see him in contrast, like to his current day, or his his peers, I guess. So,
Great. That's any other questions?
Yes. So then, I guess, does it go into this, what you're talking about here, like his prior readings, notebooks, you say when he was talking about alienation, then does it change then his later discussion of alienation in like the Communist Manifesto? Is that anything different, or?
Go ahead. I mean, I can follow you, right? But you probably are better at this.
your presentations.
I mean, well, here's the thing. Like everything he's written after is influenced by his early stuff, insofar as it's not his early stuff anymore. Like everything that he has near the end of his life, or what he's writing at the end, right, is going to be more succinct and more, I guess, accurate than anything he wrote before, especially because it's actually influenced by just a massive amount of detail of scientific studies into English working conditions and things like that. So I mean, from that respect, yeah, his later stuff is just, I think, way better informed and things like that. But maybe Chris, if you want to add something else to.
And just again, like the Communist Manifesto was published, and there's, as far as I know, I'm off the top of my head, obviously I can't regurgitate line by line. There's not really any concepts of alienation, at least rendered explicit. Obviously, there's the sort of like, yeah, man just becomes an appendage to the machine and whatever, these sorts of things. And again, it's mostly written to, the manifesto at least was written to accommodate for the revolutions that were going on at the time in Europe. They were literally drafted by the Justice League of some variety to write the manifesto, which was again published. It was meant to be published. economic philosophical manuscripts, or again, him dealing with like Hegel most specifically. And again, he focuses on these 4 concepts of alienation. One is that we're all alienated from one another, we're alienated from the products of our labor, we're alienated from nature, and probably the most just stupidest concept that Marx ever came up with is we're alienated from our species being. So if you can figure out what a species being is and show me how I'm alienated from it, that'd be cool. Not again, like it's a rhetorical jest, but like there's no such thing as a species being. There is such a thing as literacy rates, income mortality rates, people's access to healthcare, people's access to education. Like these are the things that later Marx focuses on, or more specifically, he focuses on things like how much sawdust are they putting in people's bread, and how is this contributing to their malnutrition? Like actual things that are concrete, not just sort of abstract philosophical concepts.
Any others? All right, cool. I guess move on to the next order of business.
So get back to him. Thank you.